Okay, colleagues, so honestly, I'm very excited because today, finally, we begin the Greeks. Now, in this video, I basically want to make some preliminary remarks and I suppose first and foremost explain why I enjoy the ancient Greek context so much. So basically, not only Greek philosophy, but also Greek history, Greek culture, Greek mythology. Now, since I teach philosophy, mostly today and in other videos, I will talk primarily about philosophy. But when it is relevant or instructive, I would be more than happy to draw the material from the wider Greek context. So today I want to draw an introductory sketch, again using brushstrokes, with a view mostly to the beginning of the philosophy in the ancient Greece. So in standard textbook terms, we are beginning the pre-Socratic philosophers. And we'll see how it goes, because as you know, I like to keep my classes unpredictable. But the two guiding questions I want to pose at the outset are number one, why do I think that Greek philosophy is unique? Why does it fascinate us? Why does it speak to us today? If you want, what is the value of studying these ancient texts more than 2,000 years after they've been written? And the second question, which I think is very appropriate at the outset of our journey, the question of why this unique philosophical framework emerges precisely in Greece and not somewhere else. Now, obviously, both of these are enormous questions, so I want to give basically some preliminary remarks, an overview, a sketch, a way into these questions. So let's begin and we'll see how it goes. So these days, the first thing that strikes me when I think about the ancient Greeks, and I will focus mostly on the pre-Socratics in today's video. So again, what strikes me is a certain kind, a unique and unparalleled freshness, like a genuine new beginning, in a sense that when I, or for that matter when scholars, read the pre-Socratic fragments, there is no real tradition, at least no developed philosophical tradition, that we need to keep in mind. No such tradition survives. So you get the sense of pristine wonder, a kind of metaphysical innocence if you want, which I think is uniquely conducive in terms of rethinking the basic assumptions underlying the later Western philosophical tradition that will develop. Again, the impression I get from Martin Heidegger is that he was fascinating with the pre-Socratics because it allowed him to reclaim a certain primordial sense of wonder and mystery, so to speak, the wonderful and the mysterious character of being with capital B. So also a closely related point, if one is dissatisfied with the kinds of answers that our science and our philosophy gives to the basic questions of life, again, I think it is uniquely productive and uniquely stimulating to go back and to look at the beginning of the tradition, which one way or another, for better or for worse, to a very significant extent, lies at the basis of our modern, Western, bourgeois, rational, scientific worldview. Parenthetically, let me just note that philosophers in the West who sought to question or to rethink the basic, so to speak, received philosophical framework, and three names come to mind immediately: Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, and Michel Foucault. All three, in important and significant ways, tried to go back to the ancient Greeks, to reclaim, to recover certain basic insights or instruments or attitudes. Okay, so there's obviously more to be said about this, and I'm also keeping the other question in mind, which is the genealogical question, if you want, as to why this tradition that we refer to as Western philosophy actually emerges in a particular time and in a particular place. So let me be more concrete, and let me begin at the customary starting place, namely in the city of Miletus, on the west coast of Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, around the year 600 BCE, that is, before the Common Era. So we begin with a group of three thinkers: Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. Three philosophers who, according to the later tradition, which we probably should not take too seriously, shared a teacher-student relationship. Now, a quick side note. Very often a history of philosophy, sometimes even history of science, will begin with Thales. I think there is something to be gained by also looking at the intellectual traditions outside the West. At the very least, ancient China and ancient India, maybe also ancient Mesopotamia and other places potentially. And I will definitely try to record at least several videos devoted to those traditions. I'll try to do it sooner rather than later, but we'll see how it goes. So I'm issuing another IOU to the listener, so to speak. So with that side note, back to the Milesians. So Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, the physiologoi, as they are called by Aristotle, are trying to offer an account, a rational, unified account, of more or less the basic nature of reality. Sounds like a very ambitious project, and in many ways it is, and I think there's value in seeing the basic continuity between Thales and modern quantum field theory and cosmology. I'll return to that thought in a second. So, the rational account of the basic nature of reality. Now, immediately I should add a disclaimer. This is one particular way to reconstruct their project. In fact, barely anything survives of their writings. It's just a few sentences here and there, quoted by later authors. And the basic fact that the writings of these ancient philosophers are mostly lost is, at the time, both interesting and instructive. Interesting because we are forced to engage in a kind of a reconstruction game. Fill in the blanks, so to speak. Which I think is both intellectually stimulating and a lot of fun. Although one has obviously to be quite careful not to, so to speak, read too much into those few bits and pieces that remain. On the other hand, when we think about intellectual history in general, we have to understand that intellectual history, like all histories, are written by the winners. And so the process of transmission and also translation of those ancient texts is far from innocent. The medieval Islamic, Christian, and Jewish traditions, which are largely responsible for preserving these ancient texts, the later thinkers in those monotheistic traditions had a certain way of looking at ancient Greek philosophy, a certain lens, basically a potential source of bias and distortion that one has to be careful with. Now, I don't necessarily want to accuse anyone of anything at this point. I'm just saying we should be careful. Keeping that in mind, back to the Milesians. So one obvious place to start explaining their respective philosophies is to talk about the primal substance or the primary element. The Greek word is arche. Incidentally, a word from which we derive terms such as monarchy or anarchy. So arche would be a primal substance, but also the governing principle, if you want. Or again, that's a standard way to talk about the Milesians. The standard way to reconstruct their argument from bits and pieces that are left to us. So in this oversimplified fashion, Thales seems to have alluded to the importance of water. Anaximander talks about this somewhat mysterious substance, apeiron, and Anaximenes talks about air. Now, without going into detail, and in fact I do want to maintain a fairly high level of generality in today's video, I want to immediately draw out a couple of points. So let's start with a general methodological point. So if we are correct in reconstructing the Milesian account in terms of this primal substance, what does that tell us about their method? And again, I remind you, we are reconstructing. We don't actually have anything like a detailed contemporary account of their method. But it seems natural to assume that what these philosophers were trying to do is to engage in something that we may call proto-science. What do I mean by that? So first of all, to assume that we live in one world, that there's one nature, physis, and this nature can be explained in its own terms, that the natural world follows a certain logic, a certain pattern, that nature is explicable, and that this explanation is accessible to the human intellect by some combination of observation and abstract reasoning or logic. Not only that, but if we're feeling really ambitious, if we were to interpret this succession from Thales to Anaximander to Anaximenes in a certain way, we could attribute to this rational procedure, combining reason and observations, so we could attribute to this rational procedure a public and verifiable character. And because of this public and verifiable character, therefore consequently also a potentially cumulative and progressive process of trying to understand the world. So public, intersubjective, verifiable, cumulative, and progressive process by which individual human beings, on the strength of their intellect, engaging in a public dialogue, construct, amend, and ultimately develop a rational account of how the world works. Now again, this is a highly tendentious presentation or attempt at a reconstruction of what the Milesians were up to. But this is the one I personally find most interesting, most stimulating, most productive. Now immediately we can contrast this way of proceeding to another ancient tradition, which was definitely available to the Greeks at the time. And I am talking about the mythopoetical religious tradition. The two primary names that come to mind in this respect would be Homer and Hesiod. Both Homer and Hesiod writing before Thales, and probably being more widely known than Thales, and more esteemed in the ancient Greek world. So if we look at Homer and Hesiod, it is quite clear, I think, that they have a different attitude towards reality, different assumptions. So in this kind of a naive, oversimplified fashion, we can imagine a child is born. In ancient Greece, but probably this is much more widely applicable in the history of humanity. So beyond Greece, basically, is what I'm trying to say. A child is born, and the child asks their parents something like, what is all this about? What is life about? What is the origin and the purpose of our existence here? Of the universe itself, maybe. And again, the kind of answer that we find in Homer and Hesiod, and legitimate parallels I'm sure can be drawn from other cultures, is again a kind of mythological religious answer. So whereas I said that for Milesians it seems that the explanation was natural, for Homer and Hesiod the explanation is supernatural. Both Homer and Hesiod begin their poems, especially Homer, especially works such as Iliad and Odyssey, begin with the invocation to the Muses. Sing, goddess, the wrath of Achilles, for example, is the opening line of the Iliad. So the poet, Homer, speaks not in his own voice, but he is invoking a muse, a goddess, to speak through him, so to speak, to make him her prophet. So one possible way to interpret this is through a lens of a kind of skepticism towards the abilities of human intellect. Human beings do not and cannot have access to the true nature of reality. It seems, Homer is saying. So we have to, in some sense, listen to the gods and trust the gods, what they tell us. So again, the Milesians have a natural explanation, and Homer and Hesiod have a supernatural explanation. And whereas the Milesians seem to point towards something like fixed, necessary, unchanging laws discoverable by reason. So for example, a famous story about Thales is that he was able to predict the day of an eclipse. Or another story about Thales again, how through something like a meteorological forecast, Thales was able to predict an unusual, that is, unusually plentiful harvest of olives. So we are talking about fixed, necessary, unchanging laws discoverable by reason. For the mythological tradition, the explanations seem to be grounded in the arbitrary will of the gods. So why does thunder strike? Because Zeus is angry. Why is there storm at sea? Well, this could have something to do with Neptune. And even if we have regularities, these regularities appear to be rooted in something like conventions or agreements between the gods. So, for example, a very famous story about how seasons change have to do with an arrangement between Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, and Hades, the god of the underworld. The arrangement has to do with Demeter's daughter, Persephone. Persephone, through a complicated story I don't really want to go into right now, becomes or is forced to become the bride of Hades. And so she spends basically half the year in Hades and half the year with her mother Demeter. And when Persephone is with Demeter, Demeter is cheerful and happy, and the earth blooms and the fields bloom, and we get harvest. But then Persephone goes back to the underworld, and Demeter is in mourning, and we have winter. So this reflects the constancy of the seasons, but the constancy of the seasons is not due to some kind of natural, unchanging, mathematical-like law, but it is due to an arrangement, to a contract, if you want, between Demeter and Hades. So again, to recap, in the mythological tradition, the explanation is supernatural, rooted in the arbitrary will of the gods, and this will can only be known through an act of inspiration. And it is up to gods to bestow the gift of inspiration. Gods can choose to inspire or not to inspire a particular individual. Whereas on this proto-scientific or philosophical worldview, which we fairly ambitiously attribute to the Milesians, the explanation is natural. It appeals to fixed rational laws discoverable by individual reason, in principle discoverable by any normal human being. So before I go back to some of the details of the Milesian picture of the world, let me make a general point. So why does philosophy appear in Greece? I don't think that there's anything like a simple or straightforward answer, but at the very least there's a kind of a hint. So again, as I said, the city of Miletus is situated on the western coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. This is something of a crossroads of civilizations. So as far as we can tell, you have merchants coming from ancient Egypt, from Mesopotamia. So you have a fair bit of cultural exchange going on, kind of a marketplace of ideas. Thales, incidentally, according to the standard narrative, has actually visited ancient Egypt and actually learned something there, maybe geometry or astronomy. So this exchange of ideas, I think, is very important. But another thing which may be equally important is that the Greeks are a young, or I should say relatively young, and a relatively modest civilization. By the way, we're obviously not talking about any kind of a Greek nation. We're talking about small, usually independent city-states. But still, the Greeks understand themselves to be a fairly young and fairly modest culture, surrounded by much more ancient, venerable, and illustrious, and also powerful neighbors. So in some sense, and to some extent I'm just imagining this, but still, I think it's kind of easy for an Egyptian or a Babylonian to think that their ancient sages, that their ancient tradition, that their analogues of Homer and Hesiod have everything figured out. For the Greeks, it's kind of harder to do, because the Greeks have their gods and they have their traditions, and when they look at Egypt and Babylon and see different traditions, well, this is disorienting and disconcerting to some extent. Again, if we pause just for a brief moment and think about this in the abstract, probably the vast majority of people alive on planet Earth today and throughout history, by and large, have neither the time nor the occasion to actually question their basic assumptions about the world. It's like ever since we're children, we're always busy doing this or that, and we basically just, absorb the basic assumptions of our culture and act accordingly. And I think it's a bit of a commonplace that philosophy or intellectual revolutions in general often take place in transitional times of crises, when it becomes harder to take the assumptions of your culture for granted. And I think something like that may be at play with the ancient Milesians. Again, sitting at the crossroads, looking at their more venerable, more illustrious neighbors, I think they felt some uneasiness about the sources of justification of their culture and of their myths. Like, it was slightly harder to take Homer and Hesiod for granted if you knew that much more illustrious Babylonians and Egyptians did not take Homer and Hesiod for granted. I'm obviously, oversimplifying and to a very large extent just fantasizing, but as a kind of conditional hypothetical argument, I think it's interesting to keep in mind. So often in September, when first-year students first come to a class in philosophy, I tell them this story, that even though most people never stop, or I should say never have the occasion or the time or the leisure to stop and think about their life, sometimes for a minority of people in often peculiar circumstances, there comes a point of, if you want, suspension of the normal regular course of affairs, where, again, often prompted by external circumstances, we have to stop and ask ourselves, why are we here? What are we doing? And honestly, I think at the root of philosophy, there lies this wonder, but also maybe uneasiness and also maybe anxiety, in that if we think about this question very carefully, we do not really get an ultimately, a very satisfying answer. Again, as Martin Heidegger put it, or actually as Brian McGee summarizes Martin Heidegger, like, if I think about my experience, we always already find ourselves thrown into this world, and moreover, thrown without a manual, without some kind of an authoritative, factory-given instruction on how to go about life. We always already find ourselves emerging from the unconsciousness of some earlier point in time. So maybe an unconsciousness of early childhood, or actually, if you think about this, an unconsciousness of early morning. So we find ourselves with certain dispositions, beliefs, desires, cultural attitudes, but we do not know what is the ultimate source of these, and more importantly, what is the ultimate justification of our values, beliefs, desires, attitudes, etc. Again, as Heidegger puts it, we are, so to speak, strung in time before two very disconcerting moments. This unconsciousness and therefore groundlessness in the past, thrown without a manual into this world. And in the future, this vague and anxious anticipation of death. Now, philosophers make much of the fact that our own death, my own death, can never be a fact for me. But still, I have this uneasy anticipation that at any moment I may die, and that could potentially be the end of all of my projects and aspirations. So strung between groundlessness in the past and anxiety before potential death in the future, what meaning does my life have? Now, this is obviously a very broad question, but I think that this is the essential question that lies at the root of all philosophy. And to philosophize is to keep this question in mind. And among other things, to keep this question in mind, first and foremost, means to resist the temptation to jump to conclusions. It's all too easy to convince yourself that there is some kind of an unproblematic justification, that there is, quote-unquote, the right answer to the problem of life. Just accept it, forget it, and, go back to whatever you've been busy with. And again, I think to be a philosopher is to resist this temptation. to look this question in the eye, to understand that we do not have answers, and in fact, as the Milesian and in fact all the PreSocratics story, at least as far as I read it, tells us, we can never really get a final answer, but we may try, using the only real significant instrument at our disposal, which is our reason. And more importantly, using our reason in dialogue with other human beings, double-checking, verifying, and in some very deep sense, I think that's exactly still what we're doing today. And, funny as it may sound, this is for me the ultimate motivation for teaching philosophy in general, and for making these videos in particular. You could say in this quasi-Freudian fashion that this is a rationalization or maybe a sublimation of this fear and anxiety about groundlessness in the past and anticipation of death in the future. And in order to dispel this existential horror, what philosophy is trying to do is to look those questions straight in the eye and to create a certain discourse, logos as the Greeks would say, create a certain discourse about it, to talk about it instead of being paralyzed by it, I guess. With some hope, tentative, hypothetical hope of getting some provisional answer. Okay, so on this wonderful note, I think I should be wrapping this up. So next time I'll try to talk in some more detail about the evolution of this rational account of the fundamental nature of reality, from the Milesians to Pythagoras, Parmenides, and Heraclitus, and possibly beyond. Not necessarily in detail, but again to use broad brushstrokes to paint a general picture, a general schema, a general way of categorizing and maybe wrapping our head about this multiplicity of answers that we find in ancient pre-Socratic philosophy. So I hope this was fun, and I hope you're looking forward to the continuation of our story next time. So thank you for your attention, and take care.